event for a free the Software Foundation, and we're helping to bring to you the distinguished speaker. I won't say much. We have someone else to introduce him, but I do want to first give some thanks to some of the volunteers here at Kent State that helped us put this on. We want to say thank you, Kent State, for allowing us to host this event. And we want to say thank you to the students that volunteered: West, Melanie, Isaac, Thomas, Ma, Cal, and Dwayne. You guys know who you are. Thank you very much, and we appreciate all your help. And at this time, I want to get right down to business and bring to you Dr. Austin Melton, that is going to introduce our speaker for today.
Dr. Stallman is an extremely successful programmer. He is at least partially responsible for the software systems that many of us use. For this reason alone, it's exciting to have Dr. Stallman visit Kent State University. There are other reasons why his visit is important. We are all aware that computers touch almost every aspect of our lives. We need computers to do many of the things we do. But we do not always consider how these computers and the software which controls them affect our lives. Here's a quote from Dr. Stallman. "My work on free software is motivated by an idealistic goal, spreading freedom and cooperation. I want to encourage free software to spread, replacing proprietary software that forbids cooperation, and thus make our society better." I'm excited for Dr. Stallman to be here to share his message with computer science students and faculty members. And as you can tell from the quote, there is much that we can all learn from Dr. Stallman. I would like to present the software freedom activist, author of the GNU General Public License, and president of the Free Software Foundation, Dr. Richard Stallman.
This talk will address many different threats to our freedom in the digital society, but one that is fundamental to many of those threats is software that the users do not control, non-free software. Now, I should say that you'll probably come across many activities that have as their stated goal to end the digital divide, digital inclusion, they say. They take for granted that participation in a digital society is a good thing. Well, I disagree. Participation in a digital society can be good or bad, depending on whether that digital society is just or unjust. So, if we want it to be just, if we want digital inclusion to be good, we had better defeat these threats to our freedom in the digital society. Otherwise, it will be time for projects that work for our digital extraction from the digital society. So, to start with, our freedom is threatened by the use of software that isn't free, isn't freedom respecting. Now, when I say free software, I mean libre, not gratis. I'm not talking about price, not at all. I have nothing against buying or selling copies of programs as long as those programs are ethical. In other words, as long as they respect the freedom of those who are going to use them. And that's what free software means, software that respects the user's freedom and community. It's too bad we don't have any good English word that means free only as in freedom. If we did, I would use it. Sometimes I borrow the French or Spanish word and I say libre. you could do that too, or say free Libre software so that it becomes unambiguous. But what's a program anyway? What's a computer? A computer is a conceptually simple device. All it knows how to do is get the next instruction and execute it, and get the next instruction and execute it over and over. And depending on what instructions you give it, it can do any computation. It's a universal computing device. The instructions come from the program. So the choice of program determines what the computer actually does. So the computer can basically, the same computer can do anything except for a few things that we haven't yet implemented. So who gives the instructions to your computer? You might think it's you, when really it's someone else. If your computer needs to be defenestrated. You might think the computer obeys you, when really it obeys someone else first, and you only secondarily. With a program, there are two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. There's no other way. It's always one or the other. When the users control the program, that's free software. What is freedom? Freedom is having control of your own life, control of the activities you do in your life. Well, if you use a program to do the activity, that requires having control over the program you're using to do it. In order for the users to control the program, they need the four essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the program and change it so it does your computing the way you wish. That, in practice, requires having access to the source code. There you see some source code. It's sort of like algebra. If you understand the programming language, you can read it and see what it does, and then you can see how to change it to do something different. To run it, it gets converted into an executable program, which is a bunch of ones and zeros that even a programmer has trouble figuring out the meaning of. That's a very hard job, known as reverse engineering. So practically speaking, for users to have effective control over the program, they've got to get the source code. And that's one of the criteria for free software. Well, these two freedoms give users separate control over the program. Here we see 4 users separately using this program, and one of them is changing it. With separate control, I can change my copies, and you could change your copies, and you could change your copies. But I can't change yours, you can't change mine. Well, separate control is essential, but it's not enough, because a lot of people are not programmers. They don't know how to read the source code and change it. If you give them nothing but separate control, they don't know what to do with it. So separate control is not enough, because all the users need to participate in control over what their software does. How can we enable the non-programmers to participate? With collective control, meaning you're free to work with others that want to work with you to exercise control over what that program does. Here we see a group of 3 users that are working together to adapt the program to their desires. 2 of them are directly changing the program. Apparently they're programmers. The third one is not. That one may not know how to program, but they discuss together what changes to make. And this is how non-programmers participate in control over the program. Now, you don't have to join their group. Here we see 2 other users who are not in that group. Why? Well, maybe they're happy with the program the way it is. Maybe they don't feel like working with those guys, or those guys don't feel like working with them. Who knows? The point is, they're all free to cooperate with others who are free to cooperate with them when they all want to cooperate. They could start working together or work with others or Maybe they'll start working with those 3 tomorrow, who knows? The point is not that you have to participate in such a group, but that you're free to do so. That requires 2 more essential freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to make exact copies and redistribute them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is to make copies of your modified versions and redistribute them to others when you wish. Those enable the people in the group to work together, because when one of them makes a change, she can distribute copies of that version to the others in the group, who can then pass it on to more. And it also means they're free to offer their version to others, including to the general public, if they wish. A part of these freedoms is especially morally important. That is when it's non-commercial redistribution, sharing of copies. Sharing of copies is an important part of making a society out of a bunch of unrelated individuals. Sharing copies of published works is something we must always respect and defend. Any laws or activities that try to stop people from sharing are an attack on society. Those laws have no moral authority. They deserve to be broken. And they ought to be eliminated. Which is one of many reasons you had better campaign now to kill the TPP, the treacherous plutocratic poison, as I call it. There are other more important, other nastier things in the TPP. It's a compendium of giving power to companies. It's the enemy of democracy. You can find more information about that in lots of places. Because sharing is so important, we should reject the smear term, quote, piracy, unquote, when it's used to refer to sharing. Piracy is attacking ships, and it's very bad. Sharing is good, so let's not call them both by the same name. When people ask me what I think of piracy, I say, attacking ships is very bad, let's send the Navy. When they ask what I think of movie piracy, I say, I like the first Pirates of the Caribbean. So, if the program comes with all 4 essential freedoms, then it's free software because it's controlled by the users and respects their freedom and community. If any of these freedoms is missing or insufficient, then the users don't control the program, so the program controls the users. And somebody else controls the program, which means this program is an instrument of unjust power. Power for its owner or developer over the users. Now, this means that any non-free program is an injustice. Non-free programs should not exist. And in any case, we shouldn't let them into our lives if we know what's good for our freedom. But when a company has power over people this way, what's it going to do with that power? It's going to look for ways to use it to get more power over those same victims. So it's normal, it's commonplace for the developers of proprietary software to put malicious functionalities into it. For instance, they spy on users. The iThings, those monsters made by Apple, have transmitters so that they can be tracked, and stores put receivers, sensors in to track people walking around the store. Another kind of spying is in the Amazon swindle. From time to time, it tells Amazon the title and the page number that are being read. In addition, if the user enters any notes or underlines anything, that gets sent to Amazon too. Surveilled reading. But that's not the most Orwellian thing about the Amazon swindle. Then there are the functionalities of refusing to function, refusing to let users do what they want to do. And I'm not talking about missing features. Sure, nobody's perfect. Nobody's going to put in everything the user wants. And that's not bad in itself. That's just life. Of course, if the program's free, the users are free to add what's missing. A proprietary program is unjust because it doesn't let the users do the work themselves to add what was left out. But here I'm talking about not an omission, but the intentional functionality of stopping users from doing things, and they can work for years on designing features that will stop the users from doing what they want to do, and designing them so that the users can't get around it. These are known as DRM, Digital Restrictions Management, or digital handcuffs. For instance, there's the famous evil blue ray that fights back when users try to make copies. DRM is found in many proprietary programs. It's found in Windows, in Mac OS, in the iThings, in Flash Player, and in the Amazon swindle, and many more. But they don't stop there. There's also attacking the user with backdoors. A backdoor receives a command from somebody else, telling it to do something to the user without asking the user for permission, and of course, often what it does is nasty. The Amazon swindle has a backdoor for remotely erasing books. We know this because in 2009, Amazon remotely erased thousands of copies of a particular book in an Orwellian act. Somebody came to my talk once and told me he had seen this book disappear while he was in the middle of reading it. And what was the book? It was 1984 by George Orwell. There was a lot of criticism, so Amazon promised it would never do this again unless ordered to by the state. If you've read 1984, that's not very comforting, is it? But don't worry, that wasn't a real serious promise. It was just a way to confuse the critics for a while so they'd lose their momentum. Amazon doesn't keep that promise. It went back to remotely deleting books without even an order from the state. And then there's censorship. Apple pioneered the censorship in the iThings. Censorship of applications, which Apple practices in an arbitrary fashion, often for commercial interests or sometimes apparently political prejudice. Somebody made an app for the iThings that would show information on where US drone assassinations had been carried out, and Apple keeps on refusing to allow that, finding various strange excuses. Apparently, apps are not allowed which give accurate information about where to get an abortion, but the phony crisis pregnancy centers are permitted to post their apps. The users discovered ways to get around the censorship, which they call jailbreaking, recognizing in effect that these computers are designed to be jails for the user. So that's our term for a device that censors applications. They're called jails. Microsoft imitated this policy afterwards. And there's sabotage of other kinds. Sony initially sold the PlayStation 3 with two modes of operation: playing games on the gaming network, or installing and running some other operating systems such as gnu+linux. Then somebody figured a way to break some DRM from gnu/linux, so Sony decided to get rid of that functionality in the machines already sold. So Sony published a firmware downgrade saying, if you install this downgrade, you will lose the ability to run some other operating system. But if you don't install the downgrade, you won't be able to use the gaming network anymore because the protocol's been changed and the old firmware doesn't work on it. So every user had to choose to get rid of one, to lose one functionality or the other. I mean, this should be a crime, but all these malicious functionalities ought to be crimes. However, they're generally not. And then there are universal backdoors, such as the one in Windows XP. Microsoft could impose forcibly at a distance changes in software, any change in software. Microsoft did not admit that there was a universal backdoor, but there was. Somebody figured it out. Now, in Windows 10, Microsoft openly admits that there's a universal backdoor. It's called auto update, and there's no choice about that. And this shows what's happening to the general ethical standards of the computing field. They're going down and down and down. Microsoft also admits that Windows spies on the user. In fact, it says it can access any of the user's files. The users have to agree to this to use Windows 10. Not only that, I saw yesterday, apparently Microsoft is forcibly shifting users of Windows 7 and 8 to Windows 10. Obviously, it has some kind of backdoor in Windows 7 and 8 for doing that. And there's another kind of sabotage. Microsoft shows security bugs in Windows to the NSA before it fixes them, thus giving the NSA an opportunity to attack anybody's Windows system. So this was described in the press in an article whose title was, "Can anyone ever trust Microsoft again?" Well, obviously you can't, because it's proprietary software. Well, I've only given you a few examples. I should mention, by the way, that every portable phone has proprietary software which has a universal backdoor. It's in the modem processor, and this can be used to take control of them. And nearly all models can be converted into listening devices. So they track you wherever you go, and they can listen to you. I call them Stalin's dream. Stalin would have loved to hand out a portable phone to everybody in the Soviet Union, but didn't have the ability to make them. Poor Stalin. That's why I don't have one. I'll never have a portable phone. When I saw how malicious they were, I applied the same ethical standards you probably believed in. I just take them more seriously than a lot of other people do. So from these examples, you can see nearly all users of proprietary software are using known proprietary malware. And why do they do this? It's not that they're vicious and evil. No, they're just greedy. They found ways to make money at the expense of their own users by mistreating their users, and they don't talk about it much. It isn't the general media will talk a lot about the convenience of these products and only rarely about their malicious functionalities. And when they do mention those, they do it with a sort of resignation. We couldn't possibly give up these wonderful devices, could we? Yes, we can. Now, in some cases, we know of malicious functionalities in certain proprietary programs. And then there are thousands of others where we just don't know. And we can't find out either. We can't check. So sometimes we can prove the existence of a malicious functionality. We can never prove that there aren't any, because we can't check the source code, which would be the only way. So you can never trust rationally a proprietary program. The only way to trust a proprietary program is on blind faith. So it's computing for suckers. If you don't want to be a sucker, don't trust a proprietary program. And they have so little in the way of scruples nowadays that they don't even hide what they're doing anymore. They have conferences where they meet and they present their new ways of subjugating users and say, look how clever we are. So we've got to stop using proprietary software and escape to the free world. We built the free world with the GNU operating system together with Linux, the kernel. We built a way to do computing without proprietary software. I started developing the GNU system in January 1984, specifically to get freedom. I wanted to make it possible to use a computer in freedom, which was impossible at the time. All the operating systems were proprietary. You couldn't get a new computer and run it in freedom. And the only way to make that possible was to have a free operating system, so I decided I was elected to write it. By 1992, GNU was almost finished. One essential component was missing, the kernel. The kernel is the component that allocates the machine's resources to the other programs you run. So, in 1992, Mr. Torvalds, who had a proprietary kernel called Linux, freed it. At that point, it was possible to use Linux to fill the last gap in GNU, producing a system which was complete and free. And it was basically the GNU system, but it also had Linux. In other words, it's the GNU plus Linux or GNU/Linux operating system. You'll find a lot of people call the whole thing Linux, which is not treating us right. Since we started it and we developed the biggest contribution of code, I think we deserve equal mention. So please give us equal mention. If you call it GNU plus Linux or GNU/Linux, you're giving us equal mention. And without a campaign like ours, there would never have been a free operating system. Now, GNU/Linux is basically a free operating system, but in practice, it's not always entirely free. You see, those who make distributable versions of GNU/Linux add other things, and often they add some non-free programs, making a collection that is not free as a whole. In order for a collection of programs to fully respect your freedom, every program in the collection had better respect your freedom. If there's one non-free program in it, that one takes away your freedom. And so the collection as a whole takes away your freedom. The problem is, there are over 1,000 distributions, as they're called, of GNU/Linux, and nearly all of them contain non-free software. There are just a few that are developed by people who really care about freedom, who intentionally will not put in anything non-free, because freedom is their goal. Those are the distributions we endorse. If you look at gnu.org/distros, you can see a list of the distros that are entirely free software. They have a commitment to remove any non-free software that might be found in the distro, because that's a grave ethical flaw if it has any non-free software. And then the other distros are made by people who won't make a commitment like that because freedom is not what they're working for. And they say so. In gnu.org/distros, you'll also find explanations for the widely known non-free distros about why they're non-free. What's in them that's not free, in very general terms. One of the distros that we should not recommend is called Ubuntu. It not only installs non-free software automatically and then offers a lot more non-free software, it's one of the rare examples of free software that spies on people. Now, why is it that free software doesn't usually spy on people? Because the developers know that the users control the program, and if the developers make it spy, the users can fix it. And they do. And in fact, people did make versions of Ubuntu that don't spy. It's just that Ubuntu is so known and so much promoted, they think they can get away with it. So let's show them they can't. Let's put more pressure on them and make them take out their spying facility, which is in a desktop search feature, by the way. Now, aside from the operating system, which typically is the place you'll get most of your applications also, we may run other software using the internet. For instance, many web pages contain non-free programs, but I'll talk about that later. I'll talk about both of these points later. So we want freedom in our computers, in our computing, but there are obstacles, such as the companies that subjugate people have made lots of money from that. They use that money to resist efforts to escape. They do it in various ways, between advertising and influencing the media in other ways. Well, when is the last time you saw a review of a program that addressed the question of how that program respected your freedom or not? They don't. They downplay the issue. They want people to focus on, hey, this is convenient, and not on, does it treat me with respect? Microsoft had an ad slogan, where do you want to go today? Think short term, Microsoft said. So we asked, how do you want to live in 5 or 10 or 20 years? That's the question they steer people away from. So we've got to protest these companies whenever they show up to sell things, to recruit. Another obstacle is that lots of people don't use the term free software. They never mention it. They have another term they say, quote, open source, unquote. That term was coined in 1998. That is 14 years after the beginning of the free software movement, by people who were in the free software community. They really used or distributed or even developed free software. They were real participants, but they didn't agree with the free software movement's political and ethical ideas. So, gee, what are they bringing? Are those gifts for me?
We brought you some baby news. And
Really?
And some copies of your book, if you'd like one.
Did you pack up what was outside?
No, these are from Ohio Linux Fest 2 weeks ago.
Oh. Gee, I can't carry them with me away from here. We'll just have to ship them back. There you see an example, an event that's... Is the Ohio Linux Fest really about Linux, the kernel? Or is it about GNU+Linux? One of the problems with calling the whole system Linux is it's ambiguous. Sometimes people are talking about the kernel Linux, and it's right to call it Linux in that case, but you can't tell If somebody says Linux, unless you're an expert and you find out what they're really talking about, you don't know whether they're talking about this piece, which is Linux, or they're talking about the whole GNU system. So if you call the whole system GNU plus Linux, then every time you say Linux, people will know you're talking about Torvalds' kernel. So anyway, these people didn't want to raise the issue in terms of justice or injustice, of freedom or subjection. So they coined a new term which didn't mention freedom at all, so they could construct a different discourse which presented the issue as just a matter of practical convenience, nothing deeper involved. They left out the ethical foundation of the free software movement, and they presented only the convenience parts, which they then extended and emphasized and studied in great depth. But the result is it's a different idea. In practice, it's almost the same thing. I know of one program which is open source but not free, because it's under a license that has peculiar restrictions in it. And in the free software movement, we decided that license is too restrictive. We rejected it. But the open source people accepted it. So that program is open source but not free. But nearly every open source program is free software, and every free program is open source. In practice, they're almost equivalent, just different enough that you can't treat them as substitutable. Inconvenient. But at the philosophical level, they're totally different, because free software is about freedom and community, and open source is just about powerful, reliable software. So where we say, if you develop and distribute a program, it is ethically incumbent on you to respect the user's freedom to change and redistribute that program. It's wrong to stop them. The open source people won't say that anything you do to the users is wrong. That's exactly what they don't want to say. So they say, if you develop and distribute a program, it might be in your practical interest to let the users change and redistribute it, because then they will improve the code quality. So for us, freedom and community, justice. For them, code quality. That's the big difference. Well, the majority of the community supported open source, because that's less radical in philosophy. And the companies in the community supported open source in 1998. So the politicians and the media followed them, and now in the major media you occasionally see open source. You'll never see free software. And lots of people think, they find out about our work, and it never occurs to them that we don't agree with those open source people. Every week I get several messages thanking me for my contributions to open source. I have to work to be polite and yet I have to make it clear enough that the person will do a double take and recognize that he was mistaken in thinking I was an open source supporter, because I've never supported that philosophy at all. I've seen articles in press that called me the father of open source. So I send a letter saying, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived through artificial insemination using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. Then I present the ideas of the free software movement, and that's the real point of the letter, so that the readers of that periodical will see that there's a free software movement and what it stands for, which was obviously missing from the article. But I like starting with a joke. So I do as much of this as I can, but I can't do enough. There are other free software activists. We can't do enough. We need your help. Just by insisting on saying free Libre software, you're helping us in a very important way, especially if you insist when you're in a conversation with other people that are saying open source. And the more lurkers in the conversation, the more good you can do. Show that there is an open source, there's a free software movement, and that you're supporting it. You'll help us a lot. Another obstacle is when there's hardware whose mode of use is secret, whose commands are secret. This happens very often. They say, buy our product, we won't tell you how to use it. Here's this proprietary program to run it and shut up. Well, we can't run that proprietary program, it's an injustice. So what can we do? We need reverse engineering, studying that product and its program or how they communicate to figure out how to control that product and write that down. Then, given that, someone else can write a free program to run it. This is hard work. It's a lucrative career. If you want to make a big technical contribution to the free software community, do reverse engineering. This university should have a class in reverse engineering. There are not many people who do it. But that's not all this university should teach. Every school should teach only free software. And it should teach the students why it's teaching free software. Because it's about their freedom. This is a practical civics lesson. And of course, it's not enough just to teach this in theory. The school has to act accordingly by teaching free software. It's wrong to ever teach students how to run a proprietary program. Giving children proprietary software is like giving them tobacco. Should be no surprise that there are companies that hand out gratis proprietary software to kiddies, just as tobacco companies used to hand out gratis cigarettes to kiddies for the same nasty purpose. However, classes should teach people good habits of helping other people. So every class should have this rule. Students, if you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share it with the rest of the class. So give me a copy, I'll share it with I'll copy it and share it with everybody. And you've got to bring the source code too, in case someone here wants to learn, because this class is a place where we share our knowledge. Thus, you may not bring proprietary software to this classroom unless it's for reverse engineering. The school, to set a good example, has to follow its own rule. It should bring only free software to class, including source code, and share copies with everybody that would like one. There's also the issue of education. You see, every program embodies knowledge. If it's a free program, it makes that knowledge available to the students. If it's proprietary, all the knowledge is secret, it's withheld from the students. A proprietary program is the enemy of the spirit of education and should not be tolerated in a school except for reverse engineering purposes. Whereas free software gives the students the opportunity to learn. And for those students who want to learn to be good programmers, that's exactly what they need. How do you learn to write good, clear code? By writing lots of code and reading lots of code. First, you've got to read lots of code. And only free software gives you the chance to read the code of large programs we really use. Then you've got to write lots of code. You've got to write code for large programs. Lots of code for large programs if you want to learn to be good at writing the code for large programs. Well, to get good at that, you have to start small. What does it mean to start small in writing code for large programs? It doesn't mean writing small programs. That's not even starting. No, it means writing small changes in existing large programs. Then you can advance to writing bigger changes and big changes, and eventually you can change a large program starting from zero, which is the way you write a new large program. Only free software gives you the chance to write changes in these existing programs, large programs we really use, Any school can offer its students the chance to master the craft of programming if it is a free software school. Human rights depend on each other. If you lose one, the others tend to fall down. You can't defend them anymore. And now that we use software for so many important activities in our lives and in society, free software has become one of the human rights that we need in order to defend other human rights. Defending this freedom, like defending other freedoms, sometimes requires a sacrifice. Fortunately, in our field, they tend to be small sacrifices. So don't get into the habit of saying, no sacrifice is so small I'd be willing to make it. You'll find a lot of people like that. I say, we have free software that can do this, why not switch? And they say, when you can offer me a free program that's 100% as convenient as this, that does everything just as easily, all the features, then I'll switch. What they're saying is, to them, freedom is worth exactly zero, that there is no sacrifice so small that they would make it for freedom's, for their freedom's sake. Well, the fool and his freedom are soon parted. How can you help? Well, look at gnu.org/help for a list of ways to help. If you're a programmer, you can write free software. Insist that all the software you write must be free. Or if you won't go that far, at least make the most important software you write be free. Organize to spread the ideas of the free software movement. You could learn to be a speaker. I had to learn. You can learn. You can persuade schools and governments to move to free software. You can help other users, perhaps in a gnu+linux user group. And just by saying free software, you're helping. So that's the part about free software. Now, there are other issues to cover in regard to a free digital society. One issue that people are now aware of is that of surveillance. Digital technology makes possible surveillance as was never possible before. And thanks to the great hero of our country, Edward Snowden, we know that our government is snooping on us in numerous ways. So there's something I owe him. 3 cheers for Edward Snowden. Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! We've got to say this frequently because there are lots of officials who keep trying to demonize him. We have to explicitly say that he's a hero. Not just hem and haw, well, maybe he's not quite as bad as you're saying. No, he's a hero. Among all the people working directly or indirectly for the NSA, he's the only one we knew of who kept his oath.
He did it without whistleblower protections.
Well, yeah, he couldn't really get any. So, he swore to defend the Constitution of the United States from all enemies, foreign or domestic. And he saw a domestic enemy. And he did what he could to defend the Constitution from it. Now the ball is in our hands. We are subject to much more surveillance than the inhabitants of the former Soviet Union. We are subject to so much surveillance that democracy can't survive it. Here's why. Democracy means that the people control what the state does. But in order to control it, we have to know what it's doing. However, the state acts secretly, conceals from us what it's doing. How can we find out? We need whistleblowers. But the state castigates and persecutes whistleblowers, even when they're not revealing this kind of secret, they still generally get punished horribly by the higher-ups in whatever agency they work for. Although in other fields they can get legal protection, which was not available to Snowden. And it takes them years to be vindicated in court against the retaliation that they suffered. So we need whistleblowers, but the state tries to crush them, and therefore, in order to, if the state can find them, then they get caught and crushed, and they know it, and so they won't dare do it. So if we want to have enough whistleblowers that we can find out what our state is doing, we have to make sure that they can't be found. More generally, we have to make sure that the state can't always find journalists' sources. But if the state keeps track of everybody's communications and movements, it can always find the whistleblower. A few years ago, an official went to a national security journalists conference and said, "We don't have to subpoena your records. We know who you're talking to." So, to have democracy, we must reduce the level of general surveillance to the point where the state doesn't know who's talking with whom. A point below the level of surveillance in the former Soviet Union. Not only that, but the data won't just be misused officially by the state, it'll also be misused by individual agents. For instance, at the NSA, some were caught tracking their lovers or ex-lovers. We know some were caught, we don't know how many were not caught. And this has been going on for ages. I read many years ago about a practice called running a plate for a date, where a thug would see an attractive woman drive by and would look up her license plate number in order to show up at her door someday and ask her for a date, or maybe intimidate her somehow with threats. Who knows? So you can't trust that. And in addition, the data is quite likely to leak or be obtained by crackers and thus misused by other parties as well. Political dissidents are in danger from this as well. We know that the NSA has looked for dirt about people in order to blackmail them. Now, this is not a very new practice. We know that the FBI looked for things to blackmail Martin Luther King Jr. with. It's the kind of thing that they tend to think of over and over. I believe we need to have a repeat of the Church Committee investigations that looked at how the CIA was carrying out various kinds of abuses of its power. But digital tracking of everyone makes this much easier than it was. It means that instead of going to efforts just to watch a few people, they can watch everybody. 3 years ago, if you had asked me, was the NSA tracking me? I would have said, I don't suppose so. Why would they? Now I know they're tracking me because I know they're tracking everybody. Now, we find surveillance being carried out by the government and surveillance being carried out by companies that accumulate data. It's different in detail, but it's not a very important difference because the data accumulated by the companies is easily available to the government. So Big Brother gets it all one way or another. this surveillance is often done on the internet. But it's done by other kinds of systems. You know, it's done through credit cards. It's done through portable phones. The phone companies are required in the US to accumulate databases of the locations of the phones. A few years ago, someone in Germany asked his portable phone company for a list of his own location data. The company said that for his privacy's sake, it wouldn't give him the data. So he sued, and the company had to give him the data. He got 35,000 plus records over a period of 6 months. Now that's a lot of records per day, every few minutes. It's enough to make a pretty good picture of what somebody's doing in his life. Of course, they also record the data about who you talk to, and ISPs record what sites you connect to. So generally, when browsing the web, I go through Tor. Even if it's a site that, of course, they'll know I use, like connecting to the GNU server where my email is, I still don't want them to know where I am, so I connect through Tor. And there are license plate reading cameras by the side of the road which record every car that goes by, and these data are saved for ages. There's very little limit on how they get used. Well, we need to require all of these systems to be designed so that they get only the data they absolutely must get, and that they save only the data that there's a justification to save, a need to save, and only for as long as it's needed. For instance, the license plate readers should only keep a record of license plates that are illegal or being sought. They should have lists. And when somebody whose license is validly paid up and is not sought by court order drives by, it shouldn't even see that plate. That's the way to make a system that respects people's privacy and freedom of movement. I won't use Amtrak because it demands passengers' ID. That should be changed. That shouldn't be allowed. Services like Goober, well, officially it's called Uber, but I call it Goober because they pay drivers peanuts. But there are other even worse things about Goober. For instance, making passengers identify themselves and requiring them to run non-free software to call a car. I mean, each of those is totally unacceptable. The point is, they should be required by law to give people a way to ask for a car anonymously. If we don't want a society in which all of our actions are recorded, we should require systems to be built so that they don't record all our actions. We have to limit cameras that can be used to recognize and track people moving through public places. But there's a crucial difference between a security camera and a surveillance camera. A camera of the sort that people installed 20 years ago, which records on a local data collector, so that to get the recordings you have to go there. That's a security camera. It's not a threat to everyone's privacy. It's useful because if a crime happens, then it's worth going there and collecting the recordings of that time. So for that purpose, it does work. But it's not useful for tracking everybody all the time because it would be too much of a hassle to do it. But once that camera is connected to the internet so that the data can be piped to someplace else and sent and stored in a centralized way permanently and checked over by face recognition software, then it becomes a threat. So we should require that these cameras only record locally and not have a network connection. We should put an end to the advertising-funded web and replace it with a system of anonymous payment for what you use or for the services that they now support by tracking people. I, by the way, have nothing particularly against seeing an ad. I don't mind if a website shows me an ad. I object vociferously if it tries to track me or help some other organization track me. And in practice, that's what the ads do. So I've taken precautions to block the tracking. As a side effect, it means I don't see the ads, but I wouldn't mind if it showed me some ads. But in fact, the alternative is, let me pay anonymously. We're developing a system for anonymous payments called gnu+linux. Look at taler.net, T-A-L-E-R.net for more information. The idea is that you will go to a Taler mint, which knows who you are, and buy a certain amount of Talers. And then you use those Talers to pay a website, and there's a cryptographic protocol that guarantees that no one can tell who paid. The website gets the payment, and all it can do with that payment is go back to the mint and turn it into money. The result is that this system does not enable the website to disguise how much it's been paid. It does not lend itself to tax evasion. Of course, most of the non-payment of taxes has been arranged intentionally by laws that serve the rich. And we've got to change those laws. But in general, tax evasion by businesses is a rather harmful thing. And we've designed this not to contribute to that problem. So this is something that could replace the advertising-supported web and respect people's privacy. Now, I'm willing to pay for some of the things I do on the web. I am not willing to be identified. So, in fact, I currently can't pay. So the things that I can't do anonymously, I just don't do. They're off limits because the price they would charge me is something more important than a few cents. More important than a lot of money. But I'd be happy to pay a few cents to see those things. Another threat to our freedom in the digital society is censorship. Now, in the US, most of the censorship of the internet is imposed by private companies, and it's getting tighter. But in many countries, the internet is directly censored by law. And it's not just in the countries that are obviously dictatorships like China and Iran. Finland imposed filters on the internet in 2006. Somebody decided to study the filtering practices because they don't say what they block. They don't want the victims of this censorship to know how much they're being censored. So he just got a list of sites that might be blocked and tried them, and he recorded which ones actually were blocked, and he posted this on a web page. they blocked access to his page. The law did not say that they were allowed to block access to pages that report on censorship. So he went to court, and a couple of years ago, the Finnish Supreme Court ruled in favor of blocking access to his page. The page is still there, and you could access it. It's only blocked from within Finland. So it's only the victims of Finnish censorship that can't see what Finnish censorship was doing in 2007, because he hasn't updated the page. It only reports on the censorship as of 2007. The censorship is still there, and they're stuck with it. Lots of countries that claim to be free censor the internet. In Turkey, about 6 years ago, it was announced that every internet subscriber would have to choose between censorship and more censorship, and even more censorship, and yet more censorship. 4 different levels of censorship, but there would no longer be access to the real internet in Turkey. And Turks protested on the street. And this may have been the first overt sign of how President Erdogan was moving Turkey towards tyranny. Of course, now it's pretty flagrant. And then a couple of years ago, the UK followed the same path. There are 2 levels of censorship. The uncensored internet is not allowed in the UK, so you have to choose between these 2 levels of censorship. The default is more censorship. If you can afford your own internet connection, you can choose less censorship. If you're poor and you have to use public access sites, you're stuck with more censorship. But actually, there's a lot of censorship in the UK. Freedom of speech is not very much respected there. And you can actually be put in prison for having a copy of the wrong book. There are other kinds of censorship too. Australia has censorship of links. There are links that are forbidden in Australia. Electronic Frontier Australia, which is a defender of human rights in digital activities, was ordered to remove a link to a foreign political website on pain of being fined $11,000 a day. And what was this website? It was not a terrorist site. It was something...
State or a state college.
I can't predict the future. I see dangers. I don't know what's going to happen. It depends on you.
So in that case, what can the public do? What power do we have?
Well, you got to organize. And you've got to be willing to make sacrifices. In this case, refusing to use things that are convenient or fun but attack your freedom. You've got to be ready to say no. But how to defeat the TPP? Well, there are organizations campaigning against the TPP. Your help is needed right now.